Today I want to talk about my top 10 takeaways from my favourite business book ever, which is Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad. You may have heard of it. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. I've read hundreds of business books, and Rich Dad Poor Dad consistently remains one of my favourite business books. It is my favourite business book. I reread it every year, and I have for several years now. I think I've lost track of how many years I've reread it, and it is just so I can remind myself of many of the life-changing lessons that he talks about in the book, because he thinks in a way that I think no one else in his field seems to communicate in. If you haven't heard of Rich Dad Poor Dad, it essentially tells the tale of two dads. It's based on Robert Kiyosaki's actual life experience and growing up with his best friend Mike. And his poor dad, he's actually a reference to his biological dad and the path that his dad followed. And Rich Dad, who is Mike's dad, ends up being one of the most successful business people in Hawaii, which is where they grew up. And the story goes through the lessons that the young boys learnt from Rich Dad, from Mike's dad, and what they were able to take away from that to then go on and apply to their own lives. And there is a whole bunch of gems in the book, but I just want to share what my top ones are today. And the lessons that they learnt from Rich Dad was actually something that they got from mentoring. They actively asked for mentoring from Rich Dad to be able to understand how he was able to experience the success that he had. What I find as well is that a lot of the lessons that are a part of the book apply whether we are talking about your professional brand or whether we're talking about your professional development or your financial planning as well. The book isn't meant to be designed to be about financial advice. It is designed to help you to increase your financial literacy, your financial intelligence, so that you can actually make more informed decisions as opposed to just blindly following what everyone else does without actually understanding the implications of those things. So let's dive into my top takeaway. Takeaway number one is to create your own ladder. Now, essentially, the contrast between Rich Dad and Poor Dad is that Poor Dad follows the conventional path. He studies hard, he goes to college, he gets a job, and he climbs the corporate ladder. And ultimately, he doesn't actually get any of the financial success that he may have thought that could have generated for him. He actually ends up in a more difficult position later on in his life. Contrast that with Rich Dad, who has the mentality of, why don't you create your own ladder? This is really about being prepared to do the things that other people aren't willing to do, to go against the norm and to not just follow blindly the default path and to really carve out something that could be more beneficial to you. My takeaway number two is to invest in assets. Now, one of the really key points that Rich Dad Poor Dad makes is that the rich don't work for money, they have their money work for them. So while the poor, or he refers to it sometimes as the middle class, focus more on the accumulation of what they think are assets, often this turns out to not actually be assets. They're actually just expenses that they are accumulating, as opposed to the rich who invest in assets that generate an income for them. So they generate some sort of positive net cash flow as well. And I like to apply this thinking of investing in assets beyond just even the financial lens. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is that our assets are large enough to grow by themselves. It's like planting a tree. You water it for years and then one day it doesn't need you anymore. Its roots are implanted deeply enough, then the tree provides shade for your enjoyment. So over time, your investment in your assets or in your professional brand or your personal brand, they are things that are going to pay off. You may not see the fruits of that labor immediately, but you eventually will. So I like to apply that thinking when it comes to professional development as well, and not just in the financial accumulation of physical assets way. My takeaway number 3 is mind your own business. So the book really focuses on how you can be potentially thinking outside of the box of working for someone else and living paycheck to paycheck, and instead focusing on how you can create a business that gives you independence from your employer and also more opportunities as well. And this is really moving from that mindset of a traditional 9-to-5 job and into a mindset of being more entrepreneurial and business minded. This is really about building your assets column. So, what are you actually investing in that is going to become an asset? And this is something that I also like to apply to personal branding, because I think it's really relevant when it comes to thinking outside of the box as to how you are either working for someone else or you are building long-term assets for yourself that isn't actually attached to your job or your current workplace or your current title. Because life happens and unexpected things can happen in your job, in your career, even when you think things are going amazingly well. And this is why I feel that building a personal brand that is outside of your current title and your current job acts as almost an insurance policy for your career. It gives you that opportunity to build an asset that is outside of you working in your 9-to-5 job. My takeaway number 4 from Rich Dad Poor Dad is ask yourself what business you are in. The book highlights a story about Ray Kroc of McDonald's, and he was meeting with MBA students and he proposed the question, what business do you think I am in? And understandably, people just assumed he was obviously in the fast food business or the restaurant business, and he announced that no, he was actually in the real estate business. And McDonald's is one of the biggest owners of real estate in the world, and they own some of the most prime locations in the world. And it really just makes you ask yourself, sometimes there is the business that you are in or the work that you do on a surface level, but can you see where that fits in a bigger picture? Or if you ask yourself, what business am I really in? Is that different to just what is obvious? The rich are able to think outside the box of what is obvious. Tip number 5 is don't fear standing out. So like many business books, Robert Kiyosaki uses the example of how much a lot of people hate public speaking. Actually, this is said to, in research, be the number one thing that people fear. It actually sits above death. But psychologists have said that it relates to this idea of a fear of ostracism, that we don't want to stand out from the crowd. We are naturally tribal beings, and when we stand out from the crowd, our natural survival instinct that has been hardwired into us for years becomes engaged because we don't want to do things that are outside of the norm. So that is why a lot of people fear public speaking, because it means stepping outside of that tribe and doing something that makes you stand out. And I think it's a really nice analogy when you think about fears that you have when it comes to doing things outside of the norm, whatever that might be, and bringing that back to a fear of ostracism, because then you remind yourself that that fear is just a natural survival instinct that relates to something that thousands of years ago it could have gotten us killed if we were to stand out from the tribe. We actually put ourselves in danger to just be alone doing something. But now it actually just doesn't apply in our day-to-day lives in that way. So when you're thinking about doing something that could potentially be a little bit scary or isn't what everyone else that you know is doing, just remind yourself that your survival instinct is engaged in a way that probably isn't as relevant anymore, and that you're going to be fine if you decide to try new things. This fear of ostracism causes us to conform and to not ask questions. But a lot of the time when we do that, we have short-term gains, but then we can experience long-term pain. Whereas sometimes when we do things or are brave enough to do things that are a little bit different, it means that we have short-term pain but long-term gain. My favorite takeaway number 6 that I absolutely love from Rich Dad Poor Dad is to not say the phrase, I can't afford it. So this one is really simple. It is just about replacing phrases like I can't afford it with more productive phrases like how can I afford it. So this is about shifting your mindset from a place of potential scarcity into problem solving mode. Favorite takeaway number 7 is that education precedes money. In the book, Kiyosaki says, too many people are focused on money and not on their greatest wealth, their education. So by this, Kiyosaki isn't actually referring to formal education. He's not the biggest fan of formal education, which he makes quite clear. And the reason for that is that formal education will teach you the conventional way of doing things. And obviously the whole premise of this book is to think beyond the default path. And so he's much more about self-directed learning or courses or mentorship, because he sees this as being your opportunity to learn what the majority of people are perhaps not learning. And so it's just a reminder that when it comes to money and wealth, this is preceded by education. My takeaway number 8 from Rich Dad Poor Dad is that not all debt is bad debt. So the book really highlights that the majority of people can sometimes purchase assets, or what they think are assets, that actually are liabilities. And it took the really controversial position that your house is not an asset. And this is the reason why it was rejected by a lot of publishers and had to be self-published, because it went against conventional financial advice. And what Kiyosaki is really trying to highlight is that when you are accumulating assets, that you should be focused on those assets generating a positive return for you as opposed to them being a liability. Takeaway number 9 from Rich Dad Poor Dad is to learn the history lesson. What I love about Rich Dad Poor Dad and Kiyosaki's style in general is that he's often referencing history. But he really highlights that too many people focus on referencing dates or remembering facts or events instead of actually focusing on the lesson that those things taught us. So the rich are really good at learning those lessons and doing things differently, whereas the poor potentially have not taken the opportunity to learn the lessons of history that are playing out before them. So they are more at risk of repeating the same mistakes because they haven't taken the time to learn history and to fully understand what the lesson was in that thing. And my takeaway number 10 from Rich Dad Poor Dad is that storytelling sells. So this is just a general takeaway from the book based on the success that the book has seen. Kiyosaki often highlights that he isn't necessarily the best writer, but he is a best-selling author. And I think this is something that a lot of people potentially miss in business, is just the value of storytelling. And Kiyosaki just does this, I think, so brilliantly. And it is one of my favorite references for storytelling in business, because he took an idea that could potentially have been a really dry concept to a lot of people, and he packaged it in a way that really made it resonate. Even decades on, it is still on so many recommendation lists as being a must-read business book. He took this concept and he created characters around it. He created Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And one of the key things that makes messages resonate with people is when you can create contrast. You can really show what the difference is between potential success or failure. And he does that so well with these two contrasting characters that are so easy to relate to and to be able to understand. So I do think that more people in business can take a leaf out of Kiyosaki's book when it comes to storytelling for business. If you want to learn more about the new rich, then check out my previous episode on this topic. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.